The Canon EOS R6 Mark II is supposed to be announced in the next couple of weeks, but that has left many asking a very simple question. What about the Canon EOS R5 Mark II? When is it going to be announced? Details coming up, but first, I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. So a quick recap. The Canon EOS R6 is rumored to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Now, it's a CR3 rumor. The Canon EOS R6 is real. I've gotten so many multiple sources confirming this. This camera and the 135mm L series f1.8, it's also going to be announced alongside the R6. So this is most likely going to happen within the first 2.5 weeks of November. After that, we start running into Thanksgiving in the United States. So the first 2 weeks of November is when we can expect the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. The Canon R5 is a 5 series camera, and 5 series cameras are generally announced and released every 3 to 5 years. So is there any correlation as to why Canon would release it in 3 years or 5 years? Well, yes, it's based on need of the customer, but also a need from Canon to be relevant in the marketplace. Releasing it on 3 years would mean they feel like they've got something to prove. The competition is heating up and they need to get out there. And 5 years, well, they feel like they've kind of got the market wrapped up, or they're working on some brazen technology. The Canon EOS R5 was announced back in July of 2020 and went on for sale later that month. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So the real question we need to ask ourselves is, where do we see this camera? Is it lacking in technology? Is it suffering against the competition? Sony just announced the Sony a7 R5, a camera that does 8K video. Same as the R5, same price as the R5, but these are very different cameras, but also very similar. The Sony a7 R5 beats it in terms of resolution, doing 61 megapixels, but it only does 10 frames per second. The Canon EOS R5 does 20 frames per second, but has a 45 megapixel sensor. They can both do 8K video, but the Canon EOS R5 can do 8K RAW at up to 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. 8K RAW. Canon Log 3, and it's full sensor readout, no binning, nothing like that at all, no crop. In fact, it could actually do 8K oversampled 4K. That's an awful lot of detail in 4K, better than 6K oversampled 4K. Look at all the cameras out there that can do 8K, and well, we can count them on our hands, right? There's the Nikon Z9, Sony a7 R5, Sony A1, Canon R5, and unless I'm having a bit of a mental block right now, yeah, that's 4 cameras currently. Oh, no, you're right. There is another camera, and it's a Fuji, right? So the Fuji XH can also do this, but none of them can approach the resolution and bitrate of the Canon EOS R5. It's a very fast camera when it comes to video, and on the still sides, it's no slouch either. 20 frames per second electronic, 12 frames per second mechanical. And many would argue that the R5 is the best all-around general-purpose camera out there for both video and stills. It's definitely no slouch. So the question I'm going to pose to you and then answer, is there really a huge need to provide an update to the Canon EOS R5? Is the competition destroying this camera? Even today, Canon is having trouble keeping up with demand. The camera's just flying out of the stores, and in many regions throughout the year, we're finding that the Canon R5 is simply not in stores and there's a waiting list. The Canon R5 is still one of the top-selling cameras in the world, 2.5 years after it was announced. So I don't think there's really any need to see the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, any sort of leaked announcement coming out anytime soon. I don't see the camera coming out this year in terms of any announcement, and even into 2023, which would put it at the 3-year mark, I think the focus in 2023, at least the first half, is going to be on the Canon EOS R1, and Canon's going to do its best to keep up with demand of that camera. I think the most likely time for an announcement and shipping of the R5 Mark II will be in the first half of 2024 up to July, when it was announced back in 2020. It was announced on the 9th of July, and then on the 30th, I remember, because that's when I picked mine up, it was available for, well, you could pick it up, shipping. You could purchase it, is what I'm trying to say. It's late here, so I'm having trouble. Words speak me not. Going back to the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, ask yourself this question. Is there a need for a refresh? Is there demand from the customers? And is Canon feeling the heat from the competition? And I think the answer to that question is simply yes. The a7 R4 and many other cameras, there's a whole multitude of cameras in this space. And if we look at the capabilities of the R6, dual card slots, UHS, okay, that's pretty common. 4K video, yeah, I can do that. Oversampled, sure, but 5.1K oversampled. And it overheats at 40 minutes, and of course at 30 minutes you've got that record limit. So rather annoying. You've basically got 15 to 20 minutes before your neck vein starts popping out, thinking if you're running out of time. And then of course you've got that sensor, 20 megapixels. BSI stacked? Nope. 20 megapixel sensor, same resolution as the 1DX Mark III, and it wasn't really liked by many. And even those that like this camera and buy it today will tell you that, sure, I can work with 20 megapixels, but you know, it'd be nice if it had just a little bit more. So 20 megapixels wasn't a lot back in 2020. It's certainly not a lot today, especially when we look at the competition. But other things in the camera aren't too bad. 20 frames per second electronic, 12 frames per second mechanical. It's a pretty decent camera. In fact, it's a mini 1DX Mark III, but when you look at what the competition has, there's nothing remarkable about this camera. However, come out with a backside illuminated stack sensor, the same sensor or a variant found in the R3, and well, you change things a little bit. So what we get with a backside illuminated stack sensor is, well, better low light performance, better ISO range, dynamic range. It's overall all around better in terms of video capabilities and stills capabilities. And that opens up a whole bunch of improvements to this camera. And it may still only have dual UHS 2 card slots, which for many people buying this camera isn't going to be a problem, especially when V90 cards can offer minimum sustained write speeds of 260 megabytes per second or 300 megabytes per second sustained read speeds. So that's why we're seeing Canon come out and announce the Canon EOS R6 Mark II in a couple of weeks, and why we've heard absolutely nothing about the Canon EOS R5 Mark II. So Matt, if you're really hoping for me to drop some information about the specs for the Canon EOS R5 Mark II of an impending announcement, well, let me do a compromise. So for Matt and everybody else watching, here's what I think we're going to see in the Canon EOS R5 Mark II based on what I put out in a previous video. Now, in terms of sensor resolution, frame rate, full frame, let's just talk about that right away. The Canon EOS R5 currently has a 45 megapixel sensor, and based on the speed of that, as well as the Digic X image processor, even when shooting 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, the rolling shutter is pretty minimal. It's not bad, and I've been watching a lot of movies on Prime lately and Netflix, and I gotta tell you, the amount of times I see rolling shutter, and in even some of those cinema cameras, it's worse than what I see on the R5. It's got a lot of performance, but you know what Canon's going to do? They're not going to put a backside illuminated stack sensor inside the R6 and not do that with the R5. So we'll have a backside illuminated stacked full frame sensor. But what about the resolution? Is that going to increase? And yes, I think so. Now, the level that they're going to increase it will really depend on the outcome of the Canon EOS R1. The latest rumors from Canon Rumors are stating that this R1 camera will be north of 60 megapixels, or at 60 megapixels at the very least. And if that's the case, well, what would the R5 do? I can see them bumping it up to 50 frames per second. Did I say 50 frames per second? I did, didn't I? Bumping it up to 50 megapixels. Yes, they can, and I know what you're thinking, Mark. Mark Jobs is always telling me this. There's no reason why the R5 can't go up to 60 megapixels or 55 megapixels. All I'm saying is the base, I think, for the R5 might be around 50 megapixels. It really depends on what Canon does with the R1. So we really need to wait to see what the R1 flushes out to have a better idea of what we can see in terms of resolution, but definitely more resolution, and of course, definitely faster. And of course, along with the backside illuminated stack sensor, we're gonna have better low light performance, a greater range in dynamic range, and of course, a better ISO range. All those three things kind of work together. And I know my words, I'm having trouble speaking tonight, aren't I? I know, we've just got about another 5 minutes to wrap up, probably only a minute or two for you, but let's take a look at the other specifications for this camera, the Canon EOS R5 Mark II. In terms of card slots, I think Canon's gonna stick with the single CF Express Type B. I really wish Canon would put dual CF Express Type B card slots, because then we'll have dual recording of all video modes, including 8K, rather than just 8K oversample, 4K, 4K 60, and the lot. Try to do 4K 120 or 8K RAW, it's not gonna happen. 8K All-I, not gonna happen. But 8K, IPB and IPB Lite, yes, you can dual record to a Safe Express card, and of course, a UHS card as well. Well, Canon can definitely blow past 20 frames per second electronic. In fact, they could follow Nikon and completely get away with not doing mechanical at all. So what would happen to the R5 in terms of stills? continuous shooting, could they push to 30 or even 40 frames per second? Can they do it lossless? Yes, they can, but to do that would require some compromises, and I think we'd likely see this in the R1. Canon can put in a larger buffer and a faster buffer, an NVMe type storage that's going to have multiple PCIe lanes. And let's take a look at CF Express, for example. CF Express Type A is no worse than CF Express Type B. The main difference in the architecture is it's got more PCIe lanes, and of course, CF Express Type C has even more lanes than CF Express Type B. It's the same with NVMe. It's the same technology, just packaged in a slightly different product. So if Canon puts in slightly larger storage, NVMe with more PCIe lanes, then you can capture more of that continuous shooting, high frame rates at 30 frames per second, still lossless RAW, and still work with just a measly CF Express Type B card slot. And yes, you would be limited in how long you can hold down that shutter button, but most people, myself inclusive, when you are shooting at high frame rates, you don't hold your finger over that shutter at 20 plus frames per second for seconds on time, because when you get back, you'll do it once, and when you get back to start looking over those photos, you'll be literally looking at thousands upon thousands of images. So Canon could increase the continuous still shooting rate of the R5 Mark II to something north of 20 frames per second, to 25, 26, 30, 40, whatever they choose to do. But again, they're not going to tap into that same frame rate that we're likely going to see in the Canon EOS R1. Now, one thing Canon's going to improve upon is the architecture of this. It's going to have better heat management, but the R5 with firmware 1.6 allows us to record unlimited 8K RAW, 8K oversample 4K, 4K 60 at up to 96 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius without overheating. That's pretty impressive. But the internal architecture of this camera, the thermal architecture that is pretty poor. So there is room for Canon to improve the thermal architecture so the camera doesn't have to run nearly as hot. And of course, that's going to allow us to get a much better image if we're pixel peeping. From what I see right now, 8K oversample 4K or 8K RAW looks pretty good on the R5. But one advantage we would see on the video side of things by pushing past 50 megapixels is we now get oversampled 8K. So we might only see 8K up to 30 frames per second. They might save 60 or 120 frames per second for the R1, but what we could very much get is something like 8.6K oversampled 8K at the very minimum. That would be full sensor readout based on 50 megapixels. And of course, 4K, this is pretty awesome. 8.6K oversample 4K. And what I expect with a new sensor, a new image processor, and yes, I am expecting a new image processor that's going to debut with the Canon EOS R1, that we're also going to get 8K oversampled 4K up to 60 frames per second. And that'll catch up with the competition. The Sony A7R5 allows oversampling up to 60 frames per second. Now, there are some caveats which we're not going to get into. I've covered that off in other videos. But I think that I really think that the Canon EOS R5 Mark II is going to be an incredible camera. I'm shooting with the R5 now. I had it a week before it was announced, thanks to Canon Canada, those people really helping me out by giving me a loaner. I just had surgery. I'd had my appendix removed, and I got a call in the morning. It was a weekday. I'm just getting out of the hospital, and they offered me an R5 if I'd like to have it for a weekend. And of course, I said yes. And I was pretty impressed with the camera. Now, when I first had it, of course, you're all aware of this, the overheating issues. And when I first started talking about this, people weren't too happy with me. A lot of people who like Canon and like the R5 weren't too happy with me talking about the overheating. But I felt it was important to bring up. If you're shooting video, the overheating in firmware 1.00 or even 1.1.0, it was pretty bad. In the first firmware update, you could put the camera in a freezer. You could shoot it in winter conditions and still it would overheat. Or at least the camera would say it would overheat. But now with firmware 1.6, I personally have tested it at 70 degrees and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm just shocked at how the camera just never overheats, doesn't even hint at overheating. And it's got two overheat icons that come up now, a white one and a red one. And when you see that red one, then yeah, you better pack things in. But now if you see that white one, it comes up, you realize you need to sort of slow things down, cut, do an edit point, and let the camera cool down or bring out another R5. And that's what's really nice now. If you're getting into production, you can have two cameras. If one starts to and the depth director went all the way up to 96 degrees without overheating in 8K or 8K oversample 4K. 4K 120 will overheat. I got that to overheat, and I believe 70 degrees, but definitely at 80 degrees, which is about 27 degrees Celsius. But the R5 today, 2.5 years after it was announced, is still a pretty impressive camera. There's only 5 cameras out there in the stills hybrid world that can do 8K video. And how many of them can do 8K RAW, 30 frames per second? Yeah, the Nikon Z9 can do it. The R5 can do it, but the rest can't. And that's pretty impressive. Full sensor readout. The level of detail is pretty good. And of course, if you're shooting 4K, which is what I do all the time, you're shooting with the full sensor, 8K oversample 4K, and the detail is amazing. I've shot some videos, shown you 8K videos, and I gotta tell you, what you see on YouTube compared to what I see on my screen before I export, a huge world of difference. It's incredible. It's like looking through a glass to the outside world. It's just truly amazing. So we are gonna see the Canon EOS R6 Mark II announced sometime in the next, well, what is today? Today's the 28th. You're watching this on the 29th. So let's say 2 to 3 weeks is when we're going to get the announcement of the Canon EOS R6 Mark II. The rumors are dead on this time. We're seeing a lot of facts coming out of Canon rumors. And when they put it as a CR3, to them, they're saying, look, we've got enough information that it's fact. I today have received lots of information from others saying, yeah, you know, we can validate this. The R6 Mark II is definitely coming out, as is a 135mm L series f1.8. But the R5 Mark II, crickets chirping, nothing. The R5 Mark II, there's not a hint of a rumor anywhere. And at the very earliest, we could see it sometime around the second half of 2023, or the summer announcements like we had in July of 2020. But I would give that a 5 to 10% probability. But where I think we're really going to see the R5 Mark II is in 2024 in the first half, anywhere from CP plus all the way up until May, and I'd peg that as a 95% chance probability. As far as 2025 or pushing it longer than that, no, I don't see Canon doing that. I definitely see 2024 as most likely in the first half. And if you want to stay up to date on all the latest rumors, news, and information regarding the Canon EOS R5 Mark II, the R1 or the R6 Mark II, do yourself a favor, subscribe to this channel and then choose all notifications. And the reason why you want to choose all notifications is as soon as I publish a video like this one here, you'll automatically get notified by YouTube, and you know that's going to save you an awful lot of time, so that way you can stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors. So you don't have to go hunting all the Twitter feeds, RSS feeds, your favorite websites and YouTube channels. If you're in a rush, all of this in one place. I cover all the major cameras, all the major news. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you again soon.